Let me ask you a question. What do you think is the most dangerous weapon in the world? It's not a missile, it's not some kind of cyber attack, it's something way more subtle and a whole lot more common. It's a story.
This one single idea? Wow! It became the life's work for one of the most important thinkers of our time, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. And you know what? It explains so much about how we see the world, and maybe more importantly, how the world sees us. This isn't some abstract theory either. This was a concept born right on the front lines of her own life.
So picture this. It's 2009. We're in Oxford on a global TED Talk stage. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie steps up to the mic. She's there to share a deceptively simple idea, one that would give millions of people, literally millions, a new language to understand power, identity, and truth itself. This was way more than just a speech. It was the result of a life spent figuring out how stories can lock us in and how they can set us free.
Okay, let's dive into this masterclass. We're going to trace Adichie's entire framework. We'll start with her childhood, move through the tough experiences that really shaped her thinking, then look at the powerful system she built, and finally, figure out how we can use all this in our own lives. This is the journey to understanding the real power of a second story.
So where did this all kick off? Well, it started way before any big stages, in the mind of a young girl in Nigeria. The problem wasn't something she was taught in a class. It was something she just absorbed, from the books she loved, from the world around her. As a kid, Adichie was a huge reader, but all the books she could get her hands on were British and American. They were full of white, blue-eyed kids playing in the snow, eating apples. And so, when she started to write her own stories, that's what she wrote about, snow and apples, in Nigeria. This is what she calls mental colonization. It's this deep, unconscious thing where you start to believe that the normal way for people to be, the way they should be in a book, is totally outside your own reality. It literally never even occurred to her that a girl who looked like her, with skin the color of chocolate and kinky hair, could even exist in a story. And the impact of that is just devastating. It teaches you that your life, your world, your people, they're just not important enough for a real story. So you have this internal struggle, right? This feeling of being invisible. But then, when she moves to the United States for college at just 19 years old, that internal problem becomes a very, very real external one. That single story she'd been fed in books was now being projected right back at her by everyone she met. And this right here really shows the disconnect. It's kind of jarring when you see it laid out like this. See, Adichie grew up in a university town. Her dad was a professor, her mom was an administrator. It was a middle-class home, full of books, debate, curiosity. But the second she landed in America, none of that mattered. Her whole complex life was flattened into this one tragic idea of Africa, a place where people were just poor, dying, fighting. The default emotion she got from people wasn't curiosity, it was pity. And this pity showed up in these small, constant ways. Her American roommate was genuinely shocked she knew how to use a stove. People would ask about her tribal music and then look totally confused when she pulled out a Mariah Carey tape. Her professors were always complimenting her on how well she spoke English, even though it's the official language of Nigeria. The thing is, this wasn't really coming from a place of hate. It was something much more subtle. And this is absolutely the key. The people she met meant well, but their entire picture of Africa had been painted by this one single story of catastrophe. They just couldn't imagine anything else. And that kind of pity, that well-meaning pity, is so dangerous because it feels like kindness. But it doesn't allow for complexity. It doesn't allow for you to be equals. It was right there, in those frustrating, painful moments, that her philosophy really started to form. Adichie took all of these experiences and, instead of just getting angry, she got analytical. She started to build this incredible intellectual framework to understand how stories are fundamentally tied to power, the power to literally define what's real. And she gave the problem a name: the single story. It's so simple, but so brilliant. Here's how it works. If you show a people as only one thing, over and over and over again, that is what they become in everyone's mind. The single story strips people of their dignity. It makes it almost impossible to see each other as equals, as fully human. It just highlights all the ways we're different, instead of the countless ways we're the same. Now, this part of her argument is so important. Adichie isn't saying that stereotypes are just flat-out lies. That single story about Africa having poverty and disaster, those things do exist, but they're not the only things that exist. The real danger of the single story isn't that it's false, it's that it's incomplete. And that incomplete version is passed off as the whole truth. It turns one story into the only story. So her solution, her answer to all this was to fight for narrative complexity.
This is not some passive, oh, I wish there were more stories. No, this is an active, disciplined refusal to be simplified. It's a kind of intellectual independence. She realized that the ultimate power isn't military or economic. It's the power to tell someone else's story and make that the one that sticks. Her whole life's work became about taking that power back.
Okay, so let's look at how this huge idea becomes a real, tangible practice. Adichie didn't just talk about narrative complexity, she actually built a system for putting it into her work, day in and day out.
We can really break her system down into two main parts. First, there's what you could call multivocal mapping, which is basically a deep dive into showing a ton of different voices and truths all in one story. And second, there's linguistic unapologeticness, a flat-out refusal to translate her culture just to make it easier for an outside audience.
And this just shows you exactly how she puts that system to work. For her novel, Half of a Yellow Sun, which is about the Biafran War, she spent years doing intense interviews. This wasn't just about getting the facts right, this was multivocal mapping in action. She collected all these conflicting memories from survivors, making sure no single perspective could ever be seen as the only truth. And her characters, they're never just noble victims. They're messy, they're funny, they're ambitious, they're deeply complicated, they're human. And she weaves Igbo words right into her English text, with no glossary. That's linguistic unapologeticness. It forces you, the reader, to meet her world on its own terms.
So what happens when you apply this system with so much discipline? Well, the result was a total global transformation. She didn't just write amazing books, she completely changed the conversation about culture, identity, and the power of storytelling.
I mean, just look at this journey. She goes from being this kid who's passively absorbing single stories, to a young adult having to deal with their painful effects, to this world-renowned author who is actively taking them apart in her work. And then, that 2009 TED Talk just blew up. It gave a name to a feeling that millions of people had felt but never knew how to describe. Suddenly, the phrase "the danger of a single story" was everywhere, from boardrooms to classrooms.
When you boil it all down, her biggest legacy is this. She completely destroyed the myth that there's some kind of standard human experience. You know, that unconscious idea that some people's stories are universal, while other people's stories are niche. She proved that a specific story, rooted in a specific culture, can become profoundly universal, but only if it's told with complexity and humanity. And here's where her story becomes a framework for our lives. Because this isn't just about books or big world events. This is about how we show up every single day, at work, in our communities, with our friends. Adichie's work totally redefines what empathy even is. It's not that passive, well-meaning pity she ran into as a college student. True empathy isn't about feeling sorry for somebody. It's an active intellectual discipline. It's making the choice to reject the easy single story and do the hard work of seeing a person or a situation in all its messy, complicated glory. It's about giving other people the same complexity that you give yourself.
So I'm going to leave you with a challenge. Think about your own life this week. Who have you flattened into a single story? That colleague in another department? A political group you can't stand? A whole country you only know from the news? Maybe even a family member you think you've got all figured out. Just consciously ask yourself, what is the second story? Because the single story is a trap. Finding the second, and the third, and the fourth, that's how we get free.
Because in the end, stories matter. A lot of stories matter. Stories have been used to do terrible things, to dispossess and to malign. But stories can also be used to empower, to humanize, and to repair. When we reject the single story, when we realize that there is never, ever just one story about any place or any person, we regain a kind of paradise. Remember that. The truth is never found in a single story, and your complexity, that is your greatest power.